All right, so just to review, we ended yesterday talking about the Emancipation Proclamation. When does Lincoln issue the Emancipation Proclamation? Yeah, the year I want you to memorize is 1863. That's when it goes into effect. But the actual time in which he issues the Emancipation Proclamation is in September of 1862. Remember that we proclaim this emancipation if or for any of the states that are still in rebellion after January 1st, 1863. So for your memorization date, and this is one of them, so we've got 1860 in this period, we've got 1861, 1865, and now here in the middle, 1863. I want you to memorize that 1863 date, but officially the proclamation was issued in 1862, but it goes into effect in 1863. Can somebody name for me one impact of the Emancipation Proclamation? So let's start with Michael's here. Did it free any slaves? No, because why not? Yeah, it only applies to territories not under, or to territories that are not following Union authority or not under Union control. So, for example, the parishes, that's the fancy Louisiana word for counties, the parishes around New Orleans that the Union controlled didn't apply to them. The South Carolina Sea Islands that the Union controlled doesn't apply to them. Kentucky, Tennessee, Maryland, West Virginia, all those slave states doesn't apply to them. It only applies, theoretically, in places that aren't paying attention to Lincoln in the first place. So although it does result in some slaves being sort of encouraged to free themselves, right? We see an increase in the number of runaways from like plantations towards Union lines, that kind of thing. And although as time goes on then, so after 1863, any territory that the Union conquers, those slaves then become free, right? Because now they weren't under Union control, but then the Union comes and forcibly takes them. So it will eventually free slaves. But at the moment of the Emancipation Proclamation, or on January 1st, 1863, not a single slave is really freed because nobody is listening to Lincoln, to whom they applied. Okay, another impact of the Emancipation Proclamation. Yes? Yeah, it's a morale boost, right? It's way harder to convince yourself to potentially die for the idea of union. Let's force these southern states to be part of our country, even if they don't want to. But it's easier to sort of encourage and to lead troops in a spirit of liberty and freedom. What's another impact of the Emancipation Proclamation? Foreign something. What about them? Right, so remember, by 1863, it's looking like the British are going to come in on the side of the South. They want the South to win. The South has been doing pretty well, right? They haven't lost a whole bunch of territory. They've managed to win most major battles. It's looking like the British are going to get involved. There's the whole Trent affair. They're selling like these transport ships, you know, these gunboats, just don't have guns on them yet. It's looking like the British are going to get involved. But in the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln changes the context of the war. Right now the war is not about unity or conquering territory. Now the war is about slavery, right? It's about if the Union wins, slavery will be abolished. If the Confederacy wins, slavery will continue. Britain is one of the most abolitionist countries in the world. They no longer politically can get involved. There's no way that the people of Britain will support intervening to support slavery. And if the British don't get involved, the French aren't going to get involved. And so the Union is preserved from having to worry about fighting both the Confederates and these foreign invaders, potentially. So really, the Emancipation Proclamation is a significant turning point in the course of the Civil War. But other things that happened that year are significant too. Just as a reminder, there are about 200,000 African American troops who fight for the Union. Now, perhaps this pales in comparison to the number of other Union soldiers that are going to be involved, but you have to remember, these are soldiers who are volunteering to fight, who are fighting in segregated units because they're not allowed to have black commanding officers, and who face incredible risks on the battlefield because the Confederates have made it very clear that any of these black soldiers that they capture will either be immediately executed, no prisoners of war for them, or sold into slavery. So this is a pretty big deal. And as you might have heard from the story of like the Massachusetts 54th, many of these all-black regiments fight valiantly. And in many ways, it's their efforts that have kind of prodded Lincoln towards the Emancipation Proclamation anyway. Lincoln would have argued that he didn't have the authority to abolish slavery in peacetime. Remember, when he comes to be president, when he campaigns for president, he's not arguing that we should abolish slavery. What is he saying? Simply stop the spread of slavery. So Lincoln would have argued we don't have any constitutional authority to abolish slavery in peacetime. But because of the war, he argued that the Emancipation Proclamation, just like those confiscation acts, was in fact an act of war. This is an element that he or a power that he has as commander-in-chief. Slaves are part of the war effort in the South, and so this is a thing that he has. It's also why Lincoln is then going to be a big pusher for the 13th Amendment, which will officially abolish slavery, because Lincoln's going to argue that once the war is over, the Emancipation Proclamation won't really hold up, that without the war, there's no legal basis for this law. And so he is going to begin pushing almost immediately. Now we need a 13th Amendment. We need to actually change the Constitution to ban slavery. Anyway, and so in many ways, these black troops had been a factor in all of that, right? Lincoln is swayed by their example, feels like that the Union owes these people something. You know, if they're willing to fight and save us, then we have to be able to respond and to repay that. Yes. Yeah, I mean, if the British had gotten involved militarily, they were already involved, right? They were clearly helping the South by sending them resources. But if they'd gotten militarily involved, I mean, it's difficult to think of a way that the Union would have fought and won the war in the end. Not that it would have been impossible, but that would have made it even more likely that the Union would have simply sued for peace and said, we just can't, it's not going to turn out well for us. Because we almost did that anyway, right? The Confederates, as I mentioned yesterday, do not allow African Americans to serve in their army until very late. So it's like maybe March 1865, and the war ends in April of 1865. So it's not until the last few weeks of the war that the Confederacy is really desperate. They decide, okay, fine, we'll allow slaves to serve, and after the war, if we win, those slaves will earn their freedom. But again, it doesn't last very long, and it isn't going to be enough. Okay, so let's talk about some other important things that happened in 1863, because if I had to pick a year in the Civil War that was really important, 1863 is going to be it. So not only do we have the Emancipation Proclamation going into effect, raising morale, keeping the Europeans out, and so on, we're also going to have two really important battles, the first of which is about Vicksburg. Now, Vicksburg is a city along the Mississippi River, and you can see here, through this painting, that the city of Vicksburg sits at a bend on the Mississippi River, which makes it a really strong place to maintain control over the river. So by this point, by 1863, the Union has managed to fight its way up from New Orleans towards Vicksburg, and has controlled most of the southern half of the Mississippi River, and it has managed to fight its way down from the Ohio River Valley and controls much of the upper part of the Mississippi River. But they can't use it to move troops or resources or weapons from the western front down to the New Orleans area, because the Confederates maintain strong control over this post at Vicksburg. And so this bend of the river, Union ships can't get through. They just get completely just torn apart. So General Ulysses S. Grant, who is an officer in the U.S. Army, he is not the commanding officer at this time. He's just one of the lower generals. He is tasked with, he's been working in the Western Front, trying, battles here and there. He fights against sort of like the last remnants of Confederate control there. And then he's told, you need to take Vicksburg. And so Lee tries from one direction, and that doesn't work. He tries from another direction, and that doesn't work. He tries from a third direction, that's a swamp. He loses a whole bunch of men. And so finally he decides there's really no way to take this town by force, but we can wait them out. And so he then creates this siege at Vicksburg. He surrounds the town, and they just kind of constantly shell him. He can keep reinforcing his troops, right? The Confederates can't break through these Union lines. So he keeps reinforcing his troops. His troops have plenty of supply lines, right, both from the north and from the south, so they have plenty of stuff to eat. But the Confederates in Vicksburg are struggling, right? They're not able to access their supply lines because they're now surrounded. So eventually then this culminates in sort of a final battle. Vicksburg is taken, and now the Union controls the entirety of the Mississippi River, which divides the Confederacy in half, as we had planned way back from the beginning with that. What was that plan? that Anaconda Plan, right? So we finally had accomplished that objective, and it's going to help the Union to have even more efficient means of supplying their troops, because now we can bring things up and down the Mississippi River very quickly, and then move it into or overland into those territories. So the Confederacy is recognizing that the war is not going their way. It had started out pretty good for them. The Union had been ill-prepared. The Union had terrible military leadership. The Confederacy had, really skilled troops and also this home front advantage. But the Confederates are running low on supplies. We're having these bread riots back home. The Confederate government is fairly disorganized. The Union is beginning to gain ground, mostly just because they're wearing the Confederacy down, not because they're better. The Confederacy is just kind of losing its ability to stand up. So General Lee decides that what he really needs to do is convince the North to abandon the war. Remember, that's all the South has to do to win. They just have to get the North to give up. So he decides that the best way to do that is going to be to take the war to the North. That thus far, all of these civilians in the North, they haven't had to see war up close. Nobody's marching through their fields. There's no death, laying out in the fields after a battle. There's nobody's nobody's homes are being ransacked. The North has been fairly isolated from the war, so it's a little easier to say yeah, war, if you don't have to feel the personal effects of it. So Lee decides to march north into Pennsylvania. Gettysburg is in Pennsylvania, right? So if we look at our map, here's Pennsylvania. So we're marching north. So most of the fighting has been around Richmond, and then here in the west, we're marching north into Pennsylvania. And the idea is simply to engage Union troops to kind of make havoc in the Union. Get the Union home front really upset. Make them start calling for the end of this war. And this all kind of culminates at this Battle of Gettysburg. And Lee and his forces were really well prepared. They were well organized, but they don't know a whole lot about where they're going, right? They have given up a little bit of that home front advantage. And as they are marching towards Pennsylvania, General Lee's his second in command, his very best supporting general, General Stonewall Jackson, is killed. Was actually killed by friendly fire. So Stonewall Jackson asks his men to hold this road, and he says, I'm going to go and scout and look for, he led the cavalry, so they were scouts primarily. So he goes, I'm going to go and scout around and see what I can see. That was part of what made Stonewall Jackson so valuable, is he and his troops had this sort of, this kind of uncanny ability to figure out what the other side was doing, and then that allowed Lee to make really good decisions, right, because he had great information. So Lee says, so Stonewall Jackson says, I'm going to go and kind of scout and see what's going on. Don't let anybody come down this road. Well, he comes down the road himself, and it's kind of dusk, and I don't remember the details of the story. Maybe he doesn't say the password or whatever it is. His troops get nervous. They're afraid that he is the enemy, and they're not supposed to let him pass, and so they shoot him, and he dies. And when Lee hears about this, he says, they might as well have cut off my right arm. He understands that this is bad. He's deep in enemy territory here. We're in the North now. He doesn't know what's going on. He doesn't know all the information, and now his very best scout has been killed. And so it's really that lack of information that causes Lee to push his troops into poor positions. He doesn't really realize that they're poor at the beginning, but it turns out that they're horrible positions, and the Battle of Gettysburg is an absolute massacre. Southern troops are trying to charge. You might have heard of Pickett's charge. It's led by a General Pickett. But they're asked to charge these positions, but the Union has managed to make up time, right? Lee is sort of slowed down by the problems with Stonewall Jackson and a few other things. Supplies are slow getting there. So because Lee is kind of slowed down, the Union can move some people into position. They take the high ground. There's a sort of ridge of hills in Gettysburg. So the Union sort of takes their positions at the top of this ridge. So at Pickett's charge, for example, a whole bunch of Confederates are told to charge across this stream, so wade through this water, and then run up a hill at the Union fortifications. Well, I'm not sure that you think that's going to go well, because it didn't go very well at all. In fact, it was just an absolute massacre. The whole thing was horrific. And so pretty soon, after about a week, maybe longer than that, a pretty intense fighting, the Confederacy has taken heavy losses that they cannot afford, right? Remember, the Confederacy cannot afford losses because they have fewer people to replace them with, right? That's a big struggle for them. They withdraw, right? They retreat back into the South. This did not go as planned. Now, the Union is horrified. There are many, Union families who are, now feeling the effects of the war. There is this giant cemetery. That's the Gettysburg Address. Is about dedicating a cemetery for all of these people lost in the Battle of Gettysburg. But it didn't go. It wasn't the victory that Lee was hoping for to convince the North that you've got to get out of this war. So what's going on in the North? Well, again, Lee didn't quite get what he wanted, but there is plenty of chaos going on in the North anyway. In New York, as well as in Philadelphia and in Boston and other places, but New York was the biggest, there are draft riots. Remember, the draft has been going on, and people don't want to be drafted. They don't want to go fight this war. The casualty rates are enormous. Most people, are, even if you don't die from your immediate because of injury, you'll die from gangrene or some other disease. People are frustrated. Why is this war going on? And God bless America. The idea that we're now fighting for freedom is inspirational for some and definitely is better than fighting for union, but also leads to a whole bunch of backlash against Black Americans in the North. So at the New York draft riots, for example, several African Americans are lynched. It's this sort of sense of we don't want to fight for you, we don't want to be here for you. There's lots of Irish immigrants who are part of these draft riots. There's an interesting dynamic in the United States between the Irish and African Americans. The Irish were seen as the scum of the earth. But at least they were better than Black Americans and sort of the social ladder, as it were. So the Irish are, interestingly, some of the most racist and most anti-abolitionist groups that we see in the North, because kind of like those poor Southern whites who had no slaves but still supported slavery because it at least allowed them to be better than somebody else. Well, we have these Irish immigrants who, they have experienced firsthand this thing of discrimination, but they want to be better than somebody, and so they tend to be very racist, I guess. So the draft riots go on, and so here we come now to the election of 1864. So we had some success, right? We managed to not lose at Gettysburg, we managed to take Vicksburg, but there's still really a challenge going on there. And McClellan, who had been our first general, he's running on the Democratic ticket, and here's one of his posters. It says, elect Lincoln and the Republican ticket, you will bring on Negro equality, more debt, harder times, another draft, universal anarchy, and ultimate ruin. Elect McClellan and the whole Democratic ticket, you will defeat Negro equality. They're not even pretending they're not racist, y'all. Those are the words they put on their actual sign. Restore prosperity is reestablish the Union in an honorable, permanent, and happy peace. So McClellan is arguing, vote for me, we'll end the war, we'll stop this nonsense of people dying for something we don't even care about, let's do this. And he very nearly won. But lucky for Lincoln, in this year of 1864, he has finally decided that Grant is his man. Ulysses S. Grant, who has proven himself in the West, proven himself at the Battle of Vicksburg. Clearly, we've got no other better options because all the other Union generals are terrible. Lincoln promotes Grant, and Grant becomes the military leader of the Union Army. And Grant has sort of two elements of genius. The first element of genius is that Grant finally gets it that we need to attack everywhere at once. That part of our flaw has been simply focusing our attack here and then our attack over there and so on. So we need to attack everywhere at once, and that will force the Confederates to thin their lines. So that will give us an advantage. And then Grant, unlike many of the other generals, the Union generals, is not that worried about his political reputation. He feels like his honor is to win victory. And he is willing to accept, I'm not sure this is a good thing or a bad thing, but he is willing to accept pretty staggering losses in order to achieve victory. So for example, when he begins the siege at Richmond, right? So Richmond is the Confederate capital. If that can fall, then we're going to be well on our way to finally defeating the South. Remember, to win, the North has to completely defeat the South, convince them to stop fighting. So Grant begins his plan of attack for Richmond, and he basically decides that he's just going to keep throwing troops at the Confederates. They've got really strong defenses. It is unlikely the first wave or the second wave or the third wave or the fourth wave or the however many waves, they're probably, a whole bunch of them are going to fail, and a whole bunch of Union soldiers are going to die. But eventually, right, even if every Union soldier or even if it takes 3 Union soldiers to kill 1 Confederate soldier, guess what? We have way more than 3 times as many men as they do. So his calculus is, we can stand the losses. And at this point, my job is to end the war as quickly as possible. And it might be horrific to have all these losses here in this battle, but better do it now and get the war over, or else we're going to be fighting for 10 more years. And we'll have even more losses over time. That's Grant's idea. And other generals were too afraid to do things like that, right? They felt like that they would be vilified, or they would face consequences if they lost all these men. They didn't want to do that. But Grant sort of goes, no, this is my job. War is not a good place. People are going to die, and that's the way it goes. So he begins the siege at Vicksburg, and that's exactly what happens. There's a whole bunch of really unsuccessful waves. The Confederates do a really good job of repelling those attacks. But the Confederates are slowly losing troops, and they can't afford them because now Richmond is surrounded. So the Confederates can't move in reinforcements to even they don't have many reinforcements, but even if they did, they couldn't move them in because Richmond has been cut off. And so finally, Lee and his soldiers, they abandon Richmond. They give it up. Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president of the Confederacy, they escape in the middle of the night. The town is left. They set fire to warehouses that stored tobacco and cotton, trying to make it so that the Union couldn't claim any wealth from when they take the city. The fires get out of hand and almost burn the entire city down. So there's really smoldering ruins when Grant marches in victoriously. But he's taken the capital. About a week later, Lincoln will tour Richmond with strong guard around him. He wants to sort of show his troops that he's there and he supports them, and he'll remark that the devastation that the war has caused. Meanwhile, so I should sort of back up. I sort of went all the way through the end of the Battle of Richmond. As Grant is laying siege to Richmond, he tells his best buddy, his second in command, William Tecumseh Sherman, to do another sort of unpalatable job. He tells Sherman, I want you to march into the South, cut yourself off from your supply lines, go deep into enemy territory, and take the war to the Confederate people. We are on the verge of defeating the Confederate Army, but if we want to win the war, what do we have to do? We have to get the entire South to give up. They have to accept our rule. They have to give up completely. So he tells Sherman, march into the South, cut yourself from your supply lines, live off the land, and just create total war. And Sherman understands his job. His job is to make the Confederates give up, and he does it. I promise you there are no William Tecumseh Sherman high schools anywhere in the South. Because what he does is absolutely pillage the land. As they march through plantations or fields, they eat whatever they can. They slaughter animals way more than they need. They burn anything they can't use to the ground. They're taking prisoners. They're destroying the few Confederate rail lines that existed. Early in the war, whenever an army would cross an enemy rail line, they would take the rail ties, these metal, bar rods or whatever, and they would bend them in half, right? But they're actually not that hard to unbend. You heat them up in the middle, you can unbend them, straighten them out. It's not that big of a deal. Well, Sherman, and so you can get your railroad up and running pretty quickly. Sherman and his men devise a way to both bend and twist the rail ties, and that so deforms the important grooves that the train has to run on, that it can't be restored. You have to make a whole new one. So they're doing that. They're absolutely destroying Southern infrastructure. There are war crimes committed, right? I mean, we can't sort of close our eyes to the idea that there's definitely sexual violence against Confederate women as these troops go through. But and all this time, Sherman is cut off from his supply lines, right? He's gone into the South. There are Confederate troops between him and the North, so he's unable to communicate. So for most of 1864, the siege is going on at Richmond, and nobody knows has Sherman's army been defeated? We don't know. We haven't heard from him. So finally, about a week before the election, maybe that's too soon, maybe it's a month before the election, not long, so maybe October or early November, 1864, Sherman makes it to Savannah, Georgia. This is Sherman's march to the sea. He makes it to Savannah, Georgia, and meets up with Union naval forces. Right now, he can send a message, and his message, I never get it right, but it's something along the lines of, Mr. President, I present to you the city of Savannah as your birthday president, or something like that. Lincoln's birthday isn't for a while, but it was here's a gift to you, the city of Savannah. I've taken it. I've been successful. I've made it. The South is laying in waste. Dun, 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 dun. And it's that victory that really pushes Lincoln over the edge. McClellan would have almost certainly won without this sort of celebratory news. Whoa, Sherman was successful. We've taken major cities in the South. Maybe we can win this thing after all. So Lincoln is going to sort of narrowly win. A few months after that, the siege at Richmond will be successful. Lee's forces will flee. Grant's forces will pursue him. They'll catch him in a place called Appomattox Courthouse. It's a house, actually. Oh, I don't have a picture of it. But the Appomattox Courthouse is sort of the location where they choose for Lee to meet with Grant and sign the terms of surrender. Grant is sort of in awe, right? He completely has absolute respect for Lee. Lee was is an incredible general. Grant had served under him during the Mexican-American War, so he's sort of starstruck by the whole thing. And so and Grant, as a military man, he recognizes that they were just fighting, right? That this was just politics. They were on two different opposite sides of the war, but that everybody was just doing their job. So Grant grants Lee's men really generous terms of surrender. So he allows them to take their weapons home with them because they need to be able to hunt, right? He allows many of them to keep their horses. And really the terms are just like, basically, don't fight back. Just go home, go back to your families. There's no big enforcement. There's no like massive punishment or like, camps for prisoners, something like that. Very easy terms. And Grant's idea is, okay, the war is over, we've got to reconcile now. And Lincoln was 100% on board with that plan. Lincoln, from the Emancipation Proclamation, had been talking about how are we going to rebuild our country? How are we going to put the country back together? Because we've been fighting this war, but we all want to be one country together again. And so Grant was on board with that, has very lenient terms. Just a few weeks later, however, President Lincoln is at the theater watching a play. And this sort of crazed Confederate sympathizer, John Wilkes Booth, is going to, he's an actor, but he's not acting in this play. He sneaks up into the president's box. He shoots him fatally. Lincoln will sort of linger on for another day or two, but he's never conscious again after that. Booth jumps down from the box onto the stage, breaks his leg, runs off, hobbles off or whatever. He's eventually found and cornered, and he's killed. But Booth was hoping that by killing Lincoln, he could convince the South to rise again. That if Lincoln was gone, that would be like a sort of a symbolic gesture that then Confederates in the South would have sort of like renewed enthusiasm and would fight back. It didn't work, but he might have done the South more harm than good because Lincoln had very lenient plans for the South. He just wanted to embrace the South again. Let's all be friends, like no punishment is needed. The war is over. On the other hand, Lincoln's successor, Andrew Johnson, would be unable to overpower Congress. The radical Republicans in Congress would therefore take control, and Reconstruction would be much more onerous for the South than it might have otherwise have been. So what are the effects of the war? Well, the best estimate, of course, there are high estimates and low estimates, but sort of the most cited estimate is about 618,000 Americans, both Union and Confederates, who died during the war, either directly from their wounds or from diseases. And that's about 2% of the population, which would be about 6 million people today. So I just want you to imagine, like, we've been fighting in Afghanistan and Iraq for 14 years, including Afghanistan. And overall, we've lost like 6,000 people total in both of those conflicts. So 15 years, 6,000, and it's a lot, right? We're sad about that, and every death is too many. But I want you to imagine, what if in 4 years, our country lost 6 million people to war? That's an incredible number. Can you just imagine the effect on the workforce, the effect on morale? It's kind of interesting to read, like, even post-Civil War era, like letters and journals and so on. They're just very morbid. Like, there's this constant sense of death, which is part of, like, they have no modern medicine and people die from all kinds of stuff. But also, like, they've just seen a huge portion of their country just sort of slaughtered. It's a really big deal. It's hard to sort of embrace how devastating the Civil War was in the country. And all the losses were American, right? I mean, like, Union, Confederate, but after the war, we're all one country again. All the losses are American. So other effects of the war. Women had seen some of their roles expand. Women had been perceived prior to the war as, like, we think of nursing as a feminine profession these days, but at that time, nursing was not a thing for ladies. First of all, you see gory stuff. Second of all, you have to, like, see people's private parts. You're going to bathe them. You're going to, deal with their injuries. You're going to undress them to get to wherever their wounds are. That was seen as, like, super scandalous that women would be involved in nursing. But yes, we don't have enough men to do anything in the Civil War, and so women are in fact pushed into the nursing profession. They have the country needs them. This is going to expand more opportunities for women. Begins to push that bubble of what are the things that women are perceived as, like, able to do. The famous Clara Barton, right, the angel of the battlefield, is going to serve here. 4 million African Americans, former slaves, are now going to be free. And the question about, like, what are we going to do with these people and how are we going to integrate them into society becomes the next pressing issue that will take us a whole century to try to sort of halfway figure out, and we're still working on that today. Inflation is rampant. It's much worse in the South. So the Union dollar is doing okay. It still has some value. It's not like you have to take your money in wheelbarrowfuls to get a loaf of bread. But the economy is struggling under the sort of like, drop in the value of the dollar. And so we have to solve that and resolve that issue. And the southern economy is absolutely in ruins. Remember, the southern economy had been all about growing cash crops. Well, now their fields are smoldering, and their infrastructure, what little they had, has been absolutely destroyed. Trying to figure out how to get the South economically viable again is a big problem. And we know, for example, most of you I think are familiar with the World War II story or the World War I story. Like, Germany's economy was left in ruins, and that didn't bode well for the future, right? It fueled more antagonism and eventually, in this case, led to World War II. So there is this real concern. We've got to help the South somehow. They've got to get some kind of economic system going because they have to be part of our country. Like, they can't just, like put a closed sign on the U.S. South and like move on and pretend it didn't happen. Like, that's not going to work. So then down here you can see the Union had largely larger people, like more Union soldiers died than Confederates, but it's a smaller percentage. So you can see, I don't know if the total figures are here for each one, but only 23% of Union soldiers were killed. By the way, that's a casualty rate of 1 in 4. Can we just take a moment for that? And 24% of Confederate soldiers. You can see, okay, so here, wounded non-mortally, so they're wounded but they don't die, almost 300,000 Union troops, but 100,000 Confederates died from disease and so on. So pretty rough stuff. So what is the political impact of all of this? Well, we have now resolved the question of whether or not the federal government is in charge, right? No more are we going to talk about, can we secede or not secede? Can we nullify laws or not nullify laws? No, the federal government, the national government is in charge. And the states have to do what it says, and they can't just pick and choose from their laws. And we have firmly established federal supremacy. We've also expanded the powers of the president. Lincoln was the most active president up to this point, even more so than Jackson, who everyone had kind of vilified. So we really established a much stronger role for the presidency, although the presidents following Lincoln won't really follow in line. But there's that precedent there for when we get to the turn of the 20th century. And then the government itself has made a whole lot of progress. For example, we have passed, during the Civil War, the U.S. Congress passes the Pacific Railway Act, which is the law that's going to provide for the Transcontinental Railroad. Guess which route we picked? North, because the South is no longer in the U.S. Congress to have a vote. So we definitely picked the northern route for that Transcontinental Railroad. They passed the Homestead Act, which is going to provide free land for people who want to move out west to settle the West, which is also going to encourage growth. We've just seen like a significant expansion in government powers as a result of the Civil War itself, and the railroads have sort of solidified their place as being super important. So we've got about 10 minutes. I'm going to run and grab something, but while I do, I want you guys to get logged in. We're going to play a quick Kahoot. I'll be right back.